My white grandparents refused to acknowledge me. Until they had no one left. My name is Jake Thompson, I'm 32 and I never knew my white grandparents. Not because they died or lived somewhere far away but because they gave me up before I was even born. Harold and Edna Wilson were their names I learned not from warm family stories but from my mother's scrappy stories when she thought I was too young to understand. They were her parents, Texas farmers with skin the color of burned-out cotton and hearts as cold as the winter wind on the plains. My mother, Carol, their only daughter, fell in love with my father, Leroy Thompson, a black guy from Houston with a wide smile and dreams of being a mechanic. And that was the end of their relationship with her, and with me. I learned the story in pieces like putting together a jigsaw puzzle that someone threw in the trash. My mom got pregnant with me at 21, and when she told my parents, they freaked out. They didn't just get mad, they cut her out of their lives like she was dead. The reason? My father. His skin was too dark for their world where everything had to be clean and white and right. They told her that she had betrayed her family, that such a marriage was a disgrace, that a child like me would not be their grandchild. They didn't even want to see me, let alone acknowledge me. Mom left their home with a small suitcase and a pride they couldn't break. And I remained a ghost to them, a stain they erased from their perfect family portrait. I grew up in Houston with my mom and dad, in a small apartment above the garage where my dad fixed cars. We weren't rich, hell, sometimes we barely made ends meet, but I had everything I needed, parents who loved me and a roof over my head. Mom rarely talked about Harold and Edna, but I could see her eyes darken when anyone mentioned her past. She told me how they kicked her out, how they called her choice a sin, how they said I would never be a part of their family. I was too young to understand, but as I got older it came to me, they hated me for who I was before I even took my first breath. That thought burned me from the inside out. I pictured them, old men with stern faces, sitting on their farm an hour outside of Austin, surrounded by fields and old prejudices. I imagined them drinking sweet tea on the veranda, discussing the weather and the neighbors, but never mentioning me. I was their blood, their grandson, but to them I was nothing. They didn't know what I looked like, what my voice was like, that I liked basketball and fried chicken on Sundays. They didn't know because they didn't want to know. And it wasn't just indifference, it was a cold, calculated choice. They chose their pride, their foolish beliefs over accepting me. I grew up feeling that emptiness like a hole in my chest. Not that I wanted their love, fuck their love, I didn't need it. But I wanted them to at least look at me to see that I was a person, not a mistake to be hidden. My mom did her best to fill that gap. She worked 2 jobs, school during the day, the diner at night, so I could study, play on the team, live a normal life. My dad taught me how to fix engines, told me stories about his grandfather who went through the war and didn't break down. They gave me a family, a real one, but somewhere in the back of my mind I still felt their shadow, Harold and Edna, who turned their backs on me without even giving me a chance. When I was 12, I found an old photograph in my mom's box under her bed. It showed her young with long blonde hair, next to 2 old men in farm clothes. Harold with hard facial features, Edna with a strange smile. I asked my mom who it was even though I already knew. She took the photo, looked at it for a long time, then put it back away. Said it was her past and had nothing to do with me. But I could see the pain in her eyes and it was killing me. They hadn't just rejected me, they'd broken her, my mom, who was better than they could have dreamed. And I swore to myself, I would never give them power over me. I grew up, went to college, got a degree in engineering, got a job at a good firm in Austin. Became a man any normal grandparents would be proud of. But they weren't. They didn't call, they didn't write, they didn't send Christmas cards. I was dead to them, non-existent. Sometimes I heard from distant relatives that Harold and Edna had other grandchildren, white, proper ones, from my mother's brother who had married the proper girl. These grandchildren they adored, pampered, took to fairs. And me? I was a dirty secret they were ashamed of. The thought sat in me like a splinter that couldn't be pulled out. I was living my life, working, meeting friends, building a career, but somewhere in the back of my mind I hated them. Not because they didn't love me, I was used to that. But for what they had done to my mom, for their racism was stronger than blood. I imagined them growing old on their farm, surrounded by their perfect relatives, and I thought, so be it. I don't need their money, their land, their recognition. I'll manage without them as I always have. But life likes its damn jokes. A few months ago everything changed. I was sitting at home after a long day drinking a beer and watching the game, when there was a knock on the door. I opened it and there they were. Harold and Edna, aged, hunched over, with faces as wrinkled as old parchment. They looked as if their lives had been crushed by a tractor, their clothes shabby, their eyes faded. They came to me, the only one they had left after 32 years of silence. And I stood there looking at them, feeling everything inside me turn upside down. Why did they hate me so much? And why were they here now after all these years? I grew up without Harold and Edna, and frankly I didn't care about their existence most of the time. They cut me out of their lives before I was even born, and I'd gotten used to that hole in the family tree. Mom and Dad were my world. Houston, our little apartment over the garage, the smell of butter and fried chicken on the weekends. They left me no time to miss the old people who hated me for the color of my skin. But that emptiness was still there somewhere inside, like an old scar that whined when the weather turned bad. I didn't want their recognition, to hell with their recognition, but I wanted to understand why I was such a curse to them. Mom rarely talked about them, but sometimes I caught scraps. She mentioned how Harold stomped his feet when he found out about Daddy, how Edna cried when she called her marriage the end of everything. They were the kind of Texas farmers for whom purity of blood was more important than air. Mom left them with her head held high with pride, but I could see that wound bleeding through her for years. She worked herself to exhaustion to give me everything: school, basketball uniforms, a chance at a normal life. Dad taught me to keep my head up, told me I shouldn't have to prove my worth to anyone, especially those who were blind to it. And I absorbed it like a sponge, building myself from the ground up in a world where Harold and Edna meant nothing. I was a good kid, not perfect, but I tried. I got straight A's and B's, played on the school team, helped my father in the garage. By 16 I could take apart an engine with my eyes closed, and Dad joked that I was going to be an engineer, not just a mechanic like him. Mom was proud of me, though she didn't say it every day. I could see it in her eyes when I brought home good grades or scored the winning goal. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew there was another family that had no idea what I was like. Harold and Edna lived an hour outside of Houston, on their farm near Austin, and I envisioned them, their stone-faced old men surrounded by proper relatives who fit their standards. Sometimes I heard about them from distant cousins I met at family gatherings on my father's side. They said Harold and Edna had other grandchildren, white, blue-eyed children from Mom's brother, Tom. Tom had married the right girl, a blonde from their circle, and his children were their pride. I heard them taking those grandchildren to fairs, buying them ponies, bragging about them to the neighbors. And me? I was a dark spot, never spoken of. One of the cousins once mentioned that Harold had called me Carol's mistake, and it cut into my brain like a rusty nail. A mistake. I was their blood, but to them I was dirt to be swept under the rug. The thought stung, but I didn't give it power. I left Houston at 18, went to the University of Texas at Austin for engineering. I worked nights at a coffee shop to pay for my dorm, studying until my eyes watered from fatigue. I didn't just want a degree, I wanted to prove I could be somebody, even if Harold and Edna would never know. I graduated with honors, got a job with a firm that built bridges and roads all over the state. By 25 I was managing projects. By 32 I was a senior engineer at a salary my parents could only dream of. I bought a house in suburban Austin, not a palace, but with a big garage where I tinkered with cars on weekends, just like Dad had taught me. I built my life one step at a time, and every time I achieved something I thought, here you go, old people. You gave up on me and I got up without your help. That night when Harold and Edna knocked on my door was like a lightning strike on a clear day. I was sitting at home in Austin after a long day at work with a beer in my hand and basketball on the screen. My life was settled, a good job, my own house, friends I could have a drink with on Friday nights. For 32 years I lived without them, without their shadows, without their names in my head. They were somewhere out there in the past, like an old dusty book I'd never opened. But when I heard the knock, something inside me twitched. Opened the door and there they were, Harold and Edna, my white grandparents whom I'd only seen in that old picture in my mom's box. They stood before me, aged, hunched over, with faces as if carved out of dry wood, and I felt everything turn over inside. They looked as if life had squeezed the last juices out of them. Harold, once tall, now slouched, his hands shaking, his eyes cloudy as old glass. Edna clung to his elbow, her gray hair sticking out from under her tattered hat and her skin hanging like an empty sack. They didn't look like those rugged farmers in the picture. More like two old men who'd been crushed and tossed to the curb by time. I stood looking at them and didn't know what I felt. Anger? Yes, it was there, hot and sharp as a knife. Shock. Also because I never thought I'd see them on my doorstep. But there was something else too, cold curiosity. After 32 years of silence they had come. What? They began to speak, barely crossing the threshold. Their voices were weak, brittle, like dry branches. They said they had nowhere to go, that their farm had gone under the hammer, that they had lost everything. Harold was coughing, Edna was rubbing the edge of her coat, and they both looked at me with that pathetic pleading in their eyes. I didn't let them beyond the hallway. I didn't want their presence to tarnish my home, the place I'd built without them. They told me that their son, my Uncle Tom, and his proper white family had turned their backs on them. The very grandchildren they had spoiled with ponies and fairs were now not picking up the phone. Friends, neighbors, church all disappeared when the money ran out. And so they came to me, the grandson they never recognized. I listened, arms crossed, and felt everything boiling inside. They stood in front of me asking for help as if they'd forgotten they'd crossed me off before my first scream. They didn't know me. They didn't know that I was an engineer, that I loved tinkering with machines, that I had built my life from the ground up. To them I was a nobody, a shadow they pushed away because of the color of my skin. And now that their world was falling apart, I was suddenly their last hope? It was so ridiculous I almost laughed in their faces. But instead of laughing, anger burst out of me, pure, fiery anger, like the Texas sun in July. I thought back to everything I'd heard about them. How they'd adored Uncle's kids, white, blue-eyed, right? How they bragged about them to everyone while I grew up in Houston, invisible to them. How they kicked my mom out, called her choice a disgrace, disowned me without even a glance. And now they're here because they have no one left. Their racism, their pride, their stupid rules, it all led them here, to me, to someone they hated without even knowing. I looked at them and thought, is this a joke of fate? Or a punishment for their blindness? They looked pathetic, but I didn't feel pity. Not right away. Harold coughed harder, Edna clutched his hand, and I noticed her shivering, not from the cold but from weakness. They were old, sick, lost, but that didn't soften me. I'd carried this anger for too long, this scar from their rejection. They didn't deserve my home, my help, my time. But I didn't kick them out right away. Told them I'd think about it and closed the door, leaving them on the porch. I needed time to digest it, their faces, their pleading, their insolence to show up at my door after all. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty beer bottle, trying to figure out what was going on. They had lost the farm, the same farm where they grew cotton, and their prejudices. They'd lost Tom, his family, everyone who was part of their perfect world. And now I, the one they had rejected, was their only way out. It was almost funny if it wasn't so damn painful. I imagined them sitting on their veranda all those years ago, drinking tea, bragging about their other grandchildren, and never even mentioning me. And now their world had crumbled and they had come to me as their last chance. I didn't know what to do. Anger screamed at me to throw them out, slam the door and forget them just as they had forgotten me. But something inside, not pity but some cold feeling, made me think. They were old, weak, needed by no one. And I, their blood, was facing choices I didn't want. My life was mine, my job, my home, my freedom, and I didn't want to share it with them. But their arrival shook up everything I'd buried deep inside. I stood up, walked across the room, feeling the floor creak under my feet, and thought, why are they here? Why me? They came back the next day. They knocked again, standing in the same place with the same miserable faces. I opened the door and they began again, the farm, the debts, the loneliness. I listened, but something new was growing inside me, not anger, but a question. They had come because they had no choice, but what did that mean to me? I had achieved everything without them, a career, a home, pride, and now they were asking for a piece of it. I closed the door again, saying I'd think about it some more. But I knew, this wasn't just about help. It was about them, about me, about the whole damn story I didn't want to rewrite. Why had they come to me in the first place? And what the hell am I supposed to do about it? After the second visit from Harold and Edna, I realized I couldn't just slam the door shut and forget. They came to me like ghosts from the past I didn't call, and their presence gnawed at me like rust and old metal. I told them to leave, but they left something on the porch, a tattered shoebox tied with twine. I stared at it for a minute, feeling everything inside clench, and took it inside after all. Not because I wanted their gifts, to hell with their gifts, but because I knew there might be an answer there. Why did they come to me? And what the hell had made them overstep their pride after 32 years of silence? I opened the box that night, sitting at the table with a bottle of whiskey I kept for bad days. Inside were papers, old photos, some newspaper clippings. It was their world, bits and pieces of their lives that they had decided to throw at my feet. I started digging through, and each sheet was like a punch in the chest. The first thing that came across was a clipping about the sale of their farm. The headline screamed that the Wilsons' oldest ranch had gone under the hammer for debt 2 months ago. So they weren't lying, their land, their pride, everything they'd built was gone. But that wasn't the whole truth. Next I found a letter from Uncle Tom, Mom's brother. It was short, handwritten, dated 3 years ago. Tom wrote that he no longer wanted anything to do with them, that their old views had ruined the family. I froze rereading those lines. The old views. Their racism, their hatred for Dad, for me, for Mom, it didn't just affect me. They pushed away Tom, his wife, their white, proper children they adored so much. I remembered the cousins saying that Harold and Edna bragged about those grandchildren, but now I saw the other side. Their prejudices had burned all bridges, even with those they thought worthy. Then I found the photo, the same one I'd seen at Mom's, only with a note on the back. Harold had written, "Carol with us, 1988. It was the year before I was born, before she left. I looked at the young mom, her smile, and felt anger mixed with something as heavy as lead. They kicked her out, cut me out, but kept that picture all these years. What? It was like a knife in the back. They could keep the memory of her, but not what she'd created with me and Dad." I set the photo aside, feeling my hands shaking, and reached in further. There was another letter from Edna, unsent, dated 5 years ago. She was writing to Mom, asking for forgiveness but not for me. She was sorry she'd lost touch with her, that things had gone wrong. Not a word about me, not a hint that I was their grandchild. She blamed herself for the breakup, but not for what they did to me. It was their typical hypocrisy to regret the consequences but not the cause. I crumpled up the letter, tossed it on the table, and poured more whiskey. They hadn't changed. They still saw me as a mistake, a disgrace better left unmentioned. But the sickest finding was at the bottom of the letter, the hospital certificate. Harold was sick, something with his lungs, diagnosed a year ago. Edna wasn't well either, arthritis, a weak heart, a bunch of prescriptions written in her name. They were old, sick, and their time was running out. I sat looking at those papers and felt everything turn over inside. They didn't come to me because they suddenly realized their guilt. They came because they were on the edge, no money, no family, no health. Their racism had cost them everything, and I, the one they had rejected, was their last chance to survive. I stood up and walked across the room, feeling the floor shake beneath my feet. My home, the place I'd built without them, was now threatened by their shadow. They'd lost the farm because they'd refused to sell it in time, held on to their pride to the last. They had lost Tom because their views had poisoned even those they loved. And now they were standing in front of me asking for help like I was their lifeline. It was so damn unfair I wanted to scream. I'd achieved everything on my own: engineering, career, home, and them? They'd gone through life hating me, and now they were expecting me to get them out. I remembered how my mom talked about them, their coldness, their stubbornness. How they kicked her out, pregnant with me, because Daddy was black. How they spoiled the other grandchildren while I grew up in Houston, invisible to them. Their racism wasn't just words, it was their foundation, and that foundation crumbled. They were alone, and I was their only way out. I looked at that box, at their pathetic remnants of life, and I thought, they deserved it. They had dug a hole for themselves, rejecting anyone who didn't fit into their white world. But even with this anger, I could not get them out of my mind. They were sick, weak, and their pleading was like a thorn in my side. I didn't want to feel sorry for them. They didn't deserve pity after what they'd done to Mom, to me. But I couldn't just throw that box away and pretend they didn't exist. They had come to me, and that meant more than I wanted to admit. I sat looking at the empty glass and thought, are they the same as they used to be? Or had life finally broken their prejudices? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I had to decide what to do with them. Why hadn't they changed before? And how the hell am I supposed to feel now? After I found their box and dismantled their pathetic remnants of life, I found myself trapped in my own mind. Harold and Edna stood before me, not literally, but their shadows filled my house, my air, my thoughts. I sat at my desk half the night, looking at clippings, letters, hospital certificates, and felt everything tearing up inside. They'd kicked my mom out, abandoned me, built their lives on racism and pride, and now that their world was falling apart, they'd come to me as a last chance. I hated them for it, for their arrogance, for their hypocrisy, for thinking I owed them something. But I couldn't just put them out of my mind like an old rag. They were here, and I had to decide what to do with them. I stood up, poured more whiskey, and strode across the room, feeling the floorboards creak under my feet. My home, my sanctuary, my victory was now under their shadow. I'd achieved everything on my own. Engineering, my career, this garage where I fixed cars on weekends. For 32 years I had lived without them, without needing their approval, their money, their names. And now they were standing on my porch, sick, broken, asking for help. It was so damn unfair that I wanted to smash something: the bottle, the wall, their illusions. Why did I have to choose? Why did I, the one they hated, have to decide their fate? I thought back to my mom. How she worked herself to exhaustion to give me a chance. How she hid her tears when she thought I couldn't see. She had died 5 years ago. Cancer had taken her too, and I still hadn't forgiven the world for it. Harold and Edna didn't come to her funeral, didn't even send a card. They crossed her out just like they crossed me out, and I hated them for it more than anything. She was their daughter, their blood, but they chose their pride. And now they stood before me, asking for what they hadn't given her a chance. I thought of my dad, who still lived in Houston, fixing cars and watching games on Saturdays. He'd tell me to spit on them, to move on, but I couldn't let go that easily. Their box lay on the table like a landmine ready to explode. I looked at it and thought, they deserved it. They lost the farm because they clung to it like their stupid throne. Lost Tom and his family because their racism was the poison that poisoned everyone. They were left alone, sick, penniless, and I was their last straw. But I didn't want to be their savior. I didn't want to let them into my life, to give them the warmth of my home that they had never given me. They didn't deserve it, not after kicking my mom out, not after keeping me outside of their world. But the longer I thought about it, the more I felt anger mixed with something else. Not pity, fuck pity, they weren't worth it. It was something like weariness, the cold realization that their lives had crumbled and mine remained standing. I had risen from nothing, from Houston, from the apartment over the garage, from their rejection. I became an engineer, built a career, bought that house overlooking the hills of Austin. And them? They had lived their years hating me and now stood before me empty-handed. It was a victory, but it wasn't joyful. It was bitter, like the whiskey I drank while looking at their papers. I tried to imagine what Mom would have done. She was kinder than me, gentler, despite everything they'd done to her. She probably would have helped, not out of weakness but out of some inner light I never inherited. But I wasn't her. I was angry, stubborn, someone who wore their betrayal like armor. I didn't want to forgive them, I couldn't. They hadn't just rejected me, they'd broken my mom, and that was unforgivable. But neither could I just kick them out like they'd kicked us out. That would be too easy, too much like them. I wanted something else. Not revenge, not mercy, but something that would leave them with their truth. I thought about what I found in the box. Their illnesses, their debts, their loneliness, it was all real. Harold coughed as if his lungs were failing, Edna shook like a leaf in the wind. They were on the edge and I saw that. But I saw other things too, their letters, their regrets, where I wasn't. They hadn't changed. They didn't come to recognize me as a grandson, to tell me they were wrong. They came because they had no choice. It wasn't remorse, it was despair. And it stung me the most, they still hadn't seen me, even standing on my doorstep. I made my way to the garage, sat down at the workbench where I was fixing the old car, and tried to pass out. The smell of oil, the creak of metal, it always calmed me down. But not this time. Their faces, their pleading, their box, it all sat in me like a splinter. I didn't want them in my house, didn't want them in my life. But I couldn't just slam the door shut and forget like I would forget any other trash. They were my blood, albeit rotten blood, and that made it harder. I'd achieved everything without them, career, freedom, pride, but now they were here and I had to choose. I went back into the house, sat down at the table, and stared at the empty bottle for a long time. Anger screamed at me to kick them to hell, to leave them to die in their own hole. But something inside, not pity but cold calculation, said I could do more. Not for them but for myself. I could show them that I wasn't who they thought I was. Not a mistake, not a disgrace, but a man who had risen above their hatred. But how? Help them and lose myself? Or turn away and become like them? I didn't know. I stood up, feeling the fatigue pressing on my shoulders, and thought, which would I choose? And would that be the end of their shadow over me? I hadn't slept all night after I'd decided it was time to call it a night with Harold and Edna. Their box lay on the table like a mute reproach, and their plea rang in my ears like a pesky mosquito. For 32 years they hadn't known me, hadn't seen me, hadn't recognized me, their white world was too pure for someone like me. And now they stood on my porch, broken, sick, empty-handed, and begging for help. I hated them for it, for their racism, for their hypocrisy, for kicking my mom out and rejecting me. But I couldn't just throw them out like trash, and I couldn't let them into my life. I had to find my way, not for them, but for myself. In the morning they came again. Knocked on the door, stood in the same place, hunched over, eyes full of despair. Harold was coughing, Edna was shivering, and I watched them through the glass, feeling everything inside clench. These were not the rugged farmers who had cut me out of their lives. These were old men who had been crushed by time like a tractor an empty tin can. I opened the door, but I didn't let them in. I told them I had a solution, and they froze, looking at me like I was the last thread to hold on to. I didn't want their pity, I didn't want their gratitude, I wanted them to realize who I was. I told them I wouldn't let them live with me. My home was my fortress, my place that I had built without them, and I wasn't going to share it with their shadows. They lowered their heads, Edna sobbed, but I didn't stop. I told them I'd give them money, $1,000 to rent a motel for a couple weeks. I contacted social services in Austin, found them temporary housing in a senior shelter. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't mercy, it was my way of putting a stop to it. I didn't want to be their savior, but I also didn't want to be as cold as they had been to me and my mom. They stood in silence while I wrote the check. I saw Harold clench his fists, saw Edna rubbing the edge of her coat, and I knew they were expecting more. They thought I'd open the doors, tuck them in the guest room, make them soup and call them Grandpa and Grandma. But I couldn't. They didn't deserve it, not after kicking my mom out pregnant with me, not after keeping me outside their world. I'd given them exactly enough to get them off my doorstep, but no more. It was my boundary, my choice, and I could feel it setting me free. As I handed them the check, something inside clicked. I looked at them and thought, this is the end. Not their story. Their story ended when they lost the farm, Tom, everyone who was part of their white world. It was the end of their power over me. I was no longer the kid who wanted them to look at him. I was Jake Thompson, an engineer, a man who had risen from Houston without their help, without their names. They had rejected me, but I had become stronger than their hatred. And now I stood before them, not broken, not forgiven, but free. They left, dragging their feet on the sidewalk with the check in their hands and the box under their arm. I closed the door, leaned my back against it, and felt the air grow lighter. The anger that had been burning me all these days had subsided, not gone, but quieter, like distant thunder after a thunderstorm. I hadn't forgiven them. To hell with forgiveness, they didn't deserve it. They didn't change, didn't acknowledge me, didn't tell me they were wrong. They came because they had no choice, and I gave them exactly what they needed to get out of my life. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't mercy, it was justice, my justice. I sat down on the couch, turned on the game, but didn't watch. I thought about my mom, about what she would say. She'd be proud, not that I helped, but that I didn't break. She taught me to keep my head up, and I did. Thought about Dad, who was still fixing cars in Houston. He would clap me on the shoulder and say, "You did your best, son." And I knew it was true. I didn't become a carbon copy of them, didn't slam the door with the same coldness with which they kicked us out. I showed them that I was more than their prejudices, more than their rejection. A couple days later I checked in, they had checked into the shelter. I didn't call, I didn't write, I didn't expect to hear from them. They disappeared from my world as quietly as they had appeared, and I had no regrets. My house was mine again, the garage where I fixed cars, the patio where I drank beer while looking out over the hills of Austin. I was back to work, back to my projects, back to my life. But their shadow remained somewhere in the back of my mind, like an old scar that no longer hurt but reminded me of myself. I didn't know what would happen to them next, whether they would survive, whether they would find someone else, whether they would die alone. And honestly, I didn't care. I sat on the terrace a week later, beer in hand, and thought, is this the end? They had come to me because they had no one, and I had given them a chance to leave with dignity, not for them, but for me. I didn't forgive them for their mom, for myself, for their blindness. But I didn't become like them. I remained Jake, stubborn, strong, someone who had built his life without their help. And that was my victory, not loud, not sweet, but quiet and hard as the Texas soil beneath my feet. Now I move on with my life. I work, fix cars, watch games. Their box is in the closet and I don't know if I'll open it again. Maybe they'll write, maybe they'll come back, maybe they'll disappear forever. I don't know and I don't need to know. I am free of them, not from pain, not from memory, but from their power. They have given up on me, but I have become more than they could have ever imagined. And if anyone asks how I feel, I'll say, I made my choice. But what happens next? Who knows?